The Muddied Waters of Columbus, New Mexico. Bruce White and Francisco Villa. The Muddied Waters of Columbus, New Mexico. There is neither lake nor river in Columbus, New Mexico, now, nor was there on March 9, 1916, when it was raided by Mexican bandits. The muddied waters are those of history, as the events that took place over 59 years ago are almost as cloudy today as the day they occurred. Many questions about the raid remain unanswered. Was Pancho Villa at Columbus? If so, did he enter the town? How many Mexicans took part in the raid? However, the question that has concerned the amateur and professional historian of Mexico, the United States, and Germany is, why did the raid take place? What was the greater importance of the raid? Most of these questions cannot be adequately answered without an examination of the political and military career of Francisco Villa, the recent and contemporary American viewpoint of Villa, and some salient events that preceded March 9, 1916. Francisco Villa was born in about 1878 in the Mexican state of Durango with the given name of Doroteo Arango. When he was 17 years old, he became a bandit in the area of Durango and southern Chihuahua and changed his name to Francisco Villa. He probably would have remained a bandit without the coming of the Mexican Revolution of 1910. In 1911, he was commissioned a captain in the Madero Army and rose to the rank of colonel. He soon had the honorary title of general and came under the command of General Huerta. A series of intrigues followed that caused Villa to retire from the army and go briefly into the meat business. He then went into exile in El Paso, Texas. He learned that General Huerta had overthrown Madero and decided to return to Mexico and fight against Huerta. He returned to Chihuahua in 1913, where the murdered Madero's successor, Carranza, designated him as commander of all revolutionary forces in Chihuahua. His mission, as a loyal follower of Madero, was to overthrow Huerta, and Carranza seemed to be the vehicle to that end. A recent writer thought that Villa was a modern legend in that he was born at the right time to benefit from the technological invention of the typewriter, telephone, linotype, automobile, Kodak camera, motion pictures, wireless telegraph, airplane, and radio. These methods of communication and transportation augmented the existing word-of-mouth method. 2 President Woodrow Wilson was also credited for his role in Villa's ascent. Woodrow Wilson's interest in Villa expanded the Villa legend. American presidents have often sent special men on special missions. Jefferson sent Monroe to France as special envoy, Van Buren dispatched General Winfield Scott to mediate with Canada, Polk sent Slidell to Mexico and Kearny to California, Cleveland rushed Paramount Blount to Hawaii. Woodrow Wilson, after recalling the American ambassador to Mexico, and refusing to recognize the Huerta government, sent William Hale, John Lind, Paul Fuller, and George Carruthers to Mexico. 3 George Carruthers was assigned to Villa and generally held a high opinion of him. Yet the writer credited the American newspapers for increasing the legend. 4 An examination of some of the periodicals does not bear out the fact that the press always created a favorable legend. Gregory Mason wrote about Villa in 1914 with mixed feeling that generally tended toward the negative. Physically, Villa is a superb animal. His most distinguishing features are his cruel mouth, which can smile most unctuously, and his eyes, bloodshot, protruding, and piercing. A reporter who saw them blazing at Torreon describes them as the eyes of a man who will someday go crazy. They have a certain intelligence or craftiness, but they are not eyes to inspire trust. 5 Mason went on to state that Villa had relieved tension between America and Mexico over the U.S. occupation of Veracruz in 1914. He went to El Paso, Texas, on a peace mission and stated that he would not fight his good friends, the Americans. However, Mason still saw Villa as a bandit. After the death of Madero, the revolution was taken up severally by various leaders, a few, like Carranza, deserving the name patriot, more, like Villa and like Salazar, who turned federal, coming properly under the category of bandit. 7 United States editorial opinion about Villa was summarized by one periodical in 1914. 8 Herman Whitaker wrote an article in 1914 in which he tried to balance the dual role of Villa as bandit and patriot. His account tended to be favorable but cautious. Much has been written concerning Villa's evil appearance. But my first glimpse of him cancelled all previous impressions. His face, seen at rest, is good-humoured. The eyes are large, intensely brown, vividly intelligent. 9. He went on to quote an Englishman who had been with Villa for about 2 years. "I believe," he said, "that responsibility is changing Villa. Francisco Villa, the successful general, is a very different person from Pancho Villa, the bandit. At first he was all for himself. But success obliged him to talk so much about patriotism that at last he is coming to believe in it. If he is worked upon by thinking persons who come in close contact with him, it is still within the limits of the possible that he may rise to heights far beyond the vision of Pancho the bandit. It may be that the man has in him the stuff of which great national heroes are made." One another magazine in 1914, quoted a very negative newspaper article by the noted Italian journalist, Luigi Bardini. "Mr. Bardini thinks it is a little short of criminal for us to allow such a leader to receive arms, and strongly condemns our alliance with him." Albert Price watched Villa and Zapata enter Mexico City in December 1914. He reported a very cautious attitude toward the pair of them. "Mexico has seen many triumphant marches in the last few years, and each has kindled hope that soon died. Did this, the largest military parade that has ever passed through her streets, represent a power that will realize the hopes of the revolutionists? Bring a permanent good to the people out of the waste of these destroying years? Are Zapata and Villa to be the instruments of this good?" It would appear that when the contemporary press was favorably disposed toward Villa, it tended to be cautiously so. Villa appeared to be the friend of the Mexican Revolution and the United States, but many journalists remembered his background of banditry and wanted to wait and see. The majority of journalists made up their minds after March 9, 1916. In 1915, Mexican-American relations would change and once more cast Pancho Villa into the role of bandit. President Diaz was overthrown by Madero in 1911, Madero in turn was murdered by Huerta in 1913, and Carranza assumed the leadership of the Mexican Revolution in 1914 with the aid of the former Madrist, Pancho Villa. Neither President Taft nor Wilson had given diplomatic recognition to any revolutionary government. 13 At this stage in 1914, a rift developed between Carranza and his compatriots. So long as Mexico's revolutionaries had a common enemy in Victoriano Huerta, their mutual hatreds and jealousies were kept within reasonable bounds. But in the late summer of 1914, relations among various caudillos degenerated. There were no open hostilities, except on a small scale between the Constitutionalists and the Zapatistas, but there seemed no way to achieve permanent peace without a drastic change in the leadership of the revolution. This was the aim of the members of the convention as they assembled on October 10 in Aguascalientes Morelos Theater. 14 The Aguascalientes convention spelled the downfall of Villa as he and Zapata then turned their forces against Carranza. They entered Mexico City in December 1914, but this was to be the zenith of their careers. Villa fought a series of battles with the Carranzist forces during 1915 that culminated in his defeat at Celaya April 13. His adversary, General Obrecht 6N, claimed to have captured 8,000 Villistas, and even Villa admitted to George Carruthers that he had lost 6,000 men at Celaya. Villa's power and prestige were never to recover from Celaya. 5 Celaya was a beacon to the Wilson administration as to who controlled Mexico. President Wilson gave de facto recognition to the Carranza government on October 9, 1915. 16 That same day, Secretary of State Lansing ordered El Paso, Texas, and other border posts west of El Paso to detain all shipment of arms and ammunition going into Mexico. President Wilson confirmed Lansing's order on October 19, 1915, when he proclaimed an embargo on all arms and ammunitions into Mexico. 7 Villa had decided to attack the border city of Agua Prieta opposite Douglas, Arizona, prior to his knowledge of Wilson's recognition of Carranza. Obrecht 6N was again to be Villa's nemesis at Agua Prieta. Agua Prieta was the first time that the Mexicans had used European military tactics of support artillery, barbed wire, and cross-firing machine guns, and when Villa assaulted the town on November 1, 2, and 3, 1915, he was defeated. The defeat was explained by the Villistas in terms of USA to Albrecht 6N8. More will be said on this point later. Villa then turned to the city of Hermosillo. A slashing, determined attack, in the old Villa style, was beaten back from Hermosillo with losses that destroyed completely the army's morale. The attack on Agua Prieta resulted in defeat. The attack on Hermosillo was a disaster. In a panicky withdrawal, the Villistas were harassed by long-range artillery, and the hard Villista army began to disintegrate. By the end of November, Villa was finished as a major factor in Mexican politics. The fortune which had attended him for so long had abandoned him at the Battle of Celaya, and he had never been able to regain its favor. 19 Villa was totally defeated, or so his enemies felt. A series of telegrams started on December 17, 1915, concerning the surrender of Villa and his army. Chihuahua's Governor Fidel Avila gave the American consulate at El Paso, Texas, a request from Villa for President Wilson. Villa had asked Wilson for amnesty and refuge. On the 18th, Avila and Albrecht 6N exchanged a series of telegrams concerning the surrender of Villa and his army. Albrecht 6N stated he would receive the surrender of the army but considered Villa an outlaw. The 19th saw George Carruthers telegraph Secretary of State Lansing that Villa was probably coming to the United States to take advantage of Lansing's offer of refuge. The 20th El Paso Customs Collector Cobb telegraphed the Secretary of State that Villa had left Chihuahua with 800 men for an unknown destination. 20 General Villa once again became the outlaw Villa as he meandered along the Mexican state of Chihuahua. January 10, 1916, Villa's men struck at San Isabel. The incident was described as a massacre. The following was the account rendered by the only American survivor, Thomas B. Holmes. Our train left Chihuahua January 10 about 11 a.m. Was stopped at or about Rancho Beza, a point about 5 miles west of Santa Isabel, between 1:30 and 2 o'clock that afternoon. Last car was just inside a cut. Evans, Newman, Mack-Hatton, and I were the first to get off. Watson was getting off or about to get off the steps behind us. Just after alighting I heard a volley of rifle shots from other side of cut and just above train from a bunch of 12 or 15 men standing shoulder to shoulder and shooting directly at us, between 50 and 75 feet from us. 21 Secretary of State Lansing stated that the killing of these 16 American miners was in accordance with the recent general policy of Villa to kill Americans and requested the Carranza government to dispatch troops to protect mining camps in Chihuahua. 22 The immediate effect of the San Isabel massacre was a decree by the Mexican government that declared Francisco Villa, Rafael Castro, and Pablo Lopez outside the law and subject to execution by any Mexican citizen. 23 This was a general summary of the events in the career of Francisco Villa that led up to the Columbus raid on March 9, 1916. Villa had made a bid for political power at the Convention of Aguascalientes in October, 1914, and when he failed to oust Carranza he turned to the battlefield. His main adversary was the Carranzist General Albrecht 6N, who defeated him in a series of battles at Celaya in April, 1915, Agua Prieta in November, 1915, and demolished him at Hermosillo in December, 1915. His political battle with Carranza was lost when President Wilson gave de facto recognition to Carranza on October 9, 1915. Villa was a defeat man by January 10, 1916, when the San Isabel massacre took place. His government declared him outside the law. He had few places to turn for arms, ammunition, money, and supplies except northward to the United States. This summary alone could suffice for the explanation of the raid on Columbus, but some historians saw more to the explanation than this. Colonel Herbert J. Slocum, commander of the 13th U.S. Cavalry at Columbus, gave his account of the raid in his weekly report of general conditions along the Mexican border for the week of March 11, 1916. See Maps Appendices I and II. The bandits crossed the international boundary line at a point between 2 and 3 miles west of Border Gate, proceeded towards camp in a northeastern direction, when about 1/2 mile from camp broke into 2 attacking columns. First column moved south of camp to the east and attacked there the stables from a southeasterly direction. The second column crossed the drainage ditch parallel Deming-Columbus Road, running immediately west of camp, at the customs house, where they divided. The first half attacking camp from the west and the second half moving into town of Columbus, where they proceeded to loot, murder citizens, and burn buildings. Casualties: Mexican bandits, killed in town, camp, and to the border line, 67, Mexicans wounded and captured, 7. Total casualties of ARCOM MAND, 7 killed and 5 wounded. 1 wounded man has died since being sent to military hospital at Fort Bliss, Texas. Total men in camp at time of attack 345. Of these 79 non-combatants, 24. It will be noted that there was no mention as to the number of Mexicans that attacked Columbus. Colonel Slocum did include a figure which will be examined in the following discussion. The number of Mexicans reported involved in the Columbus raid varied from about 300 to 3,000. The modest figure of 300 came from a recent Mexican historian. 25 The 3,000 came from the noted Wilsonian biographer, Arthur S. Link. 26 A search of contemporary periodicals and newspapers revealed various figures, with the newspapers listing from 800 to 1,500 men. 27 The contemporary periodicals were a little more intemperate when they stated figures of 1,000 to 2,500 men. 28 The scholarly journals, recent magazines, and most of the secondary sources agreed that the number was from 400 to 500 men. 29 The most credible figure was stated by James A. Sandos. From the Pershing papers it is possible to reconstruct the formation and estimated strength of each detachment. Advance Guard. Colonel Candelario Cervantes 80 men. Main Body. Colonel Nicolas Hernandez 60 men. General Villa, Headquarters Staff, and Escort 80 men. General Pablo L. Sixpez 100 men. General Juan Pedrosa 40 men. General Francisco Beltran 125 men. The rear guard consisted of 10 men belonging to Beltran's detachment. Altogether there were 485 men in the attacking party. 30 The contemporary figures were very interesting to study. Cobb, customs collector at El Paso, Texas, kept the Secretary of State informed by telegram of Villa's movements south of Columbus and also of the number of Mexicans involved in the raid. He reported Villa with 300 men headed toward Columbus on March 3, 1916, with 400 men 15 miles west and 50 miles south of Columbus March 7. The day of the raid at 9 a.m. he reported between 400 and 500 men took part in the raid, and on March 10 reported that the best information obtainable said Villa had about 400 men at Columbus. 31 March 9 General Pershing telegraphed General Funston that Colonel Slocum had reported to Pershing by telephone that Villa had led the raid through Slocum's camp with an estimated 500 to 1,000 men. The following day General Funston telegraphed the U.S. Adjutant General that probably not more than 1,000 Mexicans took part in the Columbus raid. Finally, the Secretary of State, Lansing, wired Silliman and Belt, special agents to Mexico, that Villa with several hundred men had attacked Columbus. His wire was sent at 4 p.m., March 9. 32 Colonel Slocum, in his weekly report of March 11, had cautiously stated that his officers who had pursued Villa said there were 700 to 900 men. 33 This apparent confusion or exaggeration on the part of the military partially clarified why the number of Mexicans who took part in the Columbus raid has been so ill reported. The presence of Villa at the raid is another disputed point. Frank M. King, a Western cattleman, was convinced that Villa did not raid Columbus. He charged that it was Carranza's agents who perpetrated the raid in order to destroy Villa's reputation with the United States government. Mr. King dismissed eyewitness accounts of Villa's presence at Columbus. He thought that Carranza had a Mexican who resembled Villa made up to pass in the dark of the night for Villa. 34 Mr. King was not a serious historian publishing with a major firm but rather privately published his book for his friends. However, at least one serious Villa biographer stated that Villa did not take part in the Columbus raid. 35 Most sources examined agreed that Villa was at Columbus but disagreed as to whether he took part in the raid or stayed at the rear. This hypothesis that Villa stayed at the rear is discussed in detail by two serious scholars. They maintain that this was the logical place for a military commander and not with the troops in battle. Point 3 A recent study placed Villa in Columbus looting the bank and then returning to the rear. This evidence was based on an interview with a former Villista who took part in the raid. The strongest evidence to the contrary was the testimony of G.C. Pays, who was with Villa outside of town, wounded in the raid, had a leg amputated, and then remained in the U.S. Pays was only a boy of 12 at the time of the raid and remained behind with Villa to hold his father's horse. 38 A final morsel of information was an interview found in two contemporary Denver newspapers with the Mexican consul, Adelardo J. Ortiz. Mr. Ortiz believed that Villa was too shrewd to have committed the raid and that it must have been a group of independent bandits. 39 None of the evidence concerning Villa's presence at the raid is conclusive. One Mexican participant put him in the town and another left him with the reserves. This still remains a muddied area. The question of why the raid has also been muddy with no general agreement among researchers. One can hopefully understand the why of the raid if it is understood what the raid accomplished. The list of dead Americans consisted of 8 soldiers and 9 civilians. 40 The area destroyed by fire consisted of about 1 block. The buildings burned were never listed by any of the sources consulted, but most of them agreed that the fire centered around the Central Hotel. 5 of the civilians killed were residing in the Central Hotel. 41 Loot was not itemized either by any of the consulted sources. However, the contemporary newspapers listed 92 cavalry horses netted by Villa. 42 A contemporary journalist, James Hopper, did an admirable job of summarizing the prevalent reasons for the raid. He saw the attack as a strategy to embroil the U.S. with the Carranza government and therefore force his downfall. Another possibility was an attempt to force a U.S. intervention into Mexico. Villa would then recover his lost prestige and become a national hero fighting the gringo. Hopper also related rumors and sinister rumors as to the reason for the attack. The rumors were the intrigues of certain American financial interests for U.S. intervention in Mexico and the sinister rumor that a certain European nation then at war wanted to keep the U.S. busy. 43 History has altered Hopper's views since 1916, but not completely so. Research revealed 3 major schools of explanation for the raid. One school maintained that vengeance was Villa's motive, another that loot was Villa's goal, and the third that the Germans were circuitously behind the raid. These viewpoints could be classified as traditional, revisionist, and ultra-revisionist. The traditionalists have had the most advocates along with the contemporary sources that maintained American interests wanted intervention. Tom Mahoney, one-time newspaper editor and historian, has written a great deal about the vengeance theory. He wrote in 1932, that Villa sought vengeance because Mexican troops were allowed to pass through the U.S. to Agua Prieta in 1915. Villa blamed this for his defeat at Agua Prieta. Mahoney bolstered this view again in 1964.44 The Carranza state at Agua Prieta is well documented. Clendenon's opinion was that Agua Prieta would have fallen to Villa had not the U.S. given Carranza assistance. The beleaguered Carranzista at Agua Prieta, meanwhile, had a stroke of good fortune. It was no part of the policy of the United States, after recognizing Carranza, to allow Villa to regain his strength by establishing himself firmly along the border in Sonora and Chihuahua. President Wilson approved a request from the de facto government to be allowed to reinforce Agua Prieta through the United States, and trainloads of soldiers, artillery, munitions, and equipment poured through Douglas, Arizona, into Mexico. By intensive labor and free use of the privilege of shipping munitions and material through the United States, the defenders were able to make Agua Prieta almost impregnable before the first Villistas appeared in the mountain passes to the east. 45 Many of the journalists apparently had forgotten Agua Prieta by March and April, 1916, for they then saw the vengeance directed toward the Carranza government. James Hopper was typical of those journalists. The Columbus raid followed, of which everyone knows, a crazy, cruel deed, yet which bears the mark of the cunning of despair, in that, no doubt, the fallen leader, forsaken of all but his Dorados, saw there a chance to embroil his enemy Carranza with his enemy the United States, and perhaps God knows what vision of arising out of the resulting chaos as liberator of his people and hero of his nation. 46 The contemporary newspapers appeared to have based their vengeance theory on 3 or 4 sources depending on how they are viewed. The first 2 sources were interviews with captives Villa had taken prior to the raid, a Mrs. Maud Hawkwright and a Mr. Bunk Spencer. The third and/or fourth sources was a letter and some documents found on the Columbus battlefield in saddlebags. The letter was allegedly written by Villa to Zapata. The documents were reported by contemporary newspapers, but none of the consulted authorities had been able to locate them. The alleged letter survived, however. See Appendix 3, *1 is hesitant to call the documents a source as their existence has not been authenticated. The first contemporary source was Mrs. Wright, who gave the following account of her experiences with Villa. I knew that Villa intended to attack Columbus. It was freely discussed by the men and the officers. Some of the latter told me that Villa intended to kill every American he could find, but they pointed to me as an example of their decision not to harm women. Later, as we approached the border from Boca Grande, these same officers told me that Villa, his rage growing as he neared the boundary, would make torches of every woman and child, as well as of every man in Columbus. He intended, they said, to kill everybody in the United States, and would be helped by Japan and Germany. 47 Bunk Spencer is variously described as a Negro sick and as Edwin R. Spencer. He related how Villa halted his men about 8 miles from Columbus and aroused them to the point of hysteria with a speech ending with the phrase "Go and kill the gringos." 48 The mysterious documents found in the Columbus battlefield differed somewhat in the newspaper accounts. Some newspapers reported that they revealed that Villa decided to attack the U.S. after Carranza was recognized by Wilson, and others stated that the documents were orders that said to kill all the gringos. 49 The scholars consulted have been greatly concerned about the existence of any documents other than the letter, but testimony revealed that at least one person saw the alleged documents. This man was George Carruthers, U.S. State Department agent assigned to Villa. I also examined 2 large portfolios of documents that we found, that I recognized as being those of the Secretary of Villa, and they contained a great many documents of different kinds, and blank stationery, which were afterwards forwarded to Washington. 50 All of the consulted newspapers agreed on the existence of the letter written to Zapata. It was reported as written January 6, 1916, in the March 11, 1916, edition of every newspaper consulted. 5. One is curious as to their source, as the letter forwarded from the battlefield to the State Department is dated January 8, 1916. See Letter Appendix 3. Compare the text of the letter as reported in one newspaper. They were obviously the same letter. An invitation to General Emiliano Zapata to march north and join in an attack on the United States was sent by Villa in January, according to a copy of a letter found among papers the outlaw dropped in his flight. The letter was dated San Geronimo, Chihuahua, January 6, 1916. I shall not expend another shell on brother Mexicans, Villa wrote, but will prepare and organize to attack the Americans on their own soil and let them know that Mexico is a land of the free and the tomb of thornless crowns and traitors. Villa proposed that the joint movement with Zapata should take place 6 months from January 6. Villa in the letter attributed his defeat at Agua Prieta last November to the action of the United States government in permitting Carranza military authorities to send through American territory reinforcements for the Mexican town opposite Douglas, Arizona, and declared that act an invasion of the sovereignty of Mexico and an insult to the people. At that time, Villa wrote Zapata, I restrained, but with the greatest difficulty, the impulse of my troops to attack the city of Douglas. Carranza, he also stated in the letter, had sold Mexico to the United States, agreeing to lease Magdalena Bay for 99 years and giving over control of the Mexican National Railway. 52 Vengeance was the topic of 2 more government documents. Mr. William F. Buckley, an oil man in Mexico, related his testimony to the Fall Committee in 1920. I do know the version of Villa's followers as to the cause of this raid, which might be interesting to the committee. Those followers have always claimed that when Gen. Scott, the friend of Villa, met him the last time at El Paso, he solemnly promised, in his capacity as representative of the American government, that this government would never recognize Carranza. Villa reported this to his agency in New York at the time of the Pan American Conference. His followers claim that Villa raided Columbus in revenge for this alleged deception by the American government. 53 Special Agent Carruthers also informed the Secretary of State of Villa's anger before Agua Prieta in a telegram on October 31, 1915. Newspapermen interviewed Villa this afternoon gave him first news regarding recognition of Carranza and passage of troops through Amerindian territory. Villa was very indignant and defiant and is reported to have stated that he was through with any dealings with the United States and would attack Agua Prieta and also Americans if necessary. 54 Major Frank Tompkins, defender at Columbus and participant in the punitive expedition, later wrote a book about the punitive expedition. He was sure of Villa's motives 7 years before he wrote the book. Witness a letter he wrote to General William C. Brown, former military colleague, April 18, 1927. I have always thought that our State Department gave Villa a raw deal, and Villa evidently thought so too. Evidence his raid on Columbus 55. The secondary sources consulted agreed in the main that Villa's motive was revenge on the U.S. for recognizing the Carranza government, the arms embargo, aiding Carranza's troops at Agua Prieta, and a desire to perpetrate an international incident that would lead to Carranza's downfall. 56 However, a minority also believed that Villa was mentally deranged. 57 In August 1966 the author was in Villa Acuna, Mexico, and dined with one of Coahuila's most respected citizens, General Jaime Quinones, who was an ardent Villista and knew Francisco Villa from his early days as a revolutionist until the time of his death. General Quinones had only contempt for the charge that Villa was paid to raid Columbus. The reason is simple, Quinones told me Francisco Villa, who I thought was a great man in many ways, he was muy hombre, felt betrayed by the North Americans. Villa was also quite unstable. He worked himself into great anger, and it was this anger that drove him to raid Columbus. He was very, very mad. Until history provides us with documentary evidence to the contrary, the explanation by Quinones will stand. 58 President Wilson made some remarks concerning sinister and unscrupulous influences which were interpreted by the contemporary journalists as attacking American businessmen in Mexico. 5. The press of the day reacted violently to the thought that American interests were behind Villa's raid on Columbus. 60 The charge was also made by a congressman. 61 The revisionists fell into two main groups, the revisionists and the ultra-revisionists. The revisionists thought that the main objective of Villa's raid was loot. A very scholarly monograph on this theory was written by Haldane Brady, professor of English at Western Texas College, in 1965. On March 9, 1916, there were more horses at Columbus than defenders, a part of the garrison then being off post, including the commanding officer. These circumstances made the little frontier outpost a more attractive site for a guerrilla operation than, say, Fort Bliss. Had Villa been thinking in terms of vengefully inflicting casualties, Fort Bliss would have been his objective. The New Mexico incursion is adequately explained as guerrilla foraging. The driving passion of the Villistas was their need, the unremitting need of money, clothes, arms, ammunition, and, as mainstay of their profession, horseflesh. Money and clothes from ricos like Rich Sam Ravel and from the Militas, arms, ammunition, and horses. 62 Francis J. Munch paraphrased Professor Brady in 1969, and so noted in his article. An analysis of what actually happened at Columbus clearly shows that Villa raided for loot, and this was the explanation given by the United States 13th Cavalry stationed in the town. The army camp had exactly the supplies Villa needed, machine guns, munitions, and many horses, hybrids of Arabian stock. 63 Ronald Atkin held the same viewpoint in his 1969 work on the Mexican Revolution. Though Villa never explained his reasons for attacking Columbus, there seems little doubt that the prime object was to pick up guns, horses, money, and as much incidental booty as possible. 64 The ultra-revisionists fell into several categories, with those that advocated an oblique German relationship with Villa in 1915 and 1916 being in the main. The East German, Friedrich Katz at Humboldt University in Berlin, began a flurry of searches for a German link to Villa and the Columbus raid in 1962. Katz concluded that there was no way possible to brand Villa a German agent or to brand the Columbus raid made in Germany. He did raise questions for American historians when he introduced the German agent and Villa's confidant, Felix Sommerfeld. 65 Michael C. Meyer at the University of Nebraska picked up the German conspiracy idea in 1969 but considered only the year 1915. He discussed the failure of a German plan of 1915 in Mexico but raised a tantalizing conclusion. The German government was far from shattered by the turn of events. With characteristic efficiency, a secondary plan was put into operation almost immediately. Even during the period of intense negotiations with Huerta and Orozco, German intelligence agents, fully aware that the scheme might prove abortive, had initiated similar negotiations with Felix Sommerfeld, one of Pancho Villa's representatives in the United States. The intrigue between Germany and Pancho Villa lasted well into 1916, but since it has already been the subject of an interesting study, it is not necessary to repeat it here. 6. Meyer noted that he took his conclusion from Katz, and that was the interesting study he mentioned. Francis J. Munch carried the study of Sommerfeld one step farther in 1969. Whatever Sommerfeld's motives, if he did not work specifically for an attack on Columbus, New Mexico, he did indeed conspire for American intervention in Mexico. This could best be accomplished by violation of the international border. The fact that Villa acquired increased German help after the Columbus raid does support the following thesis. German foreign policy as carried out by the Admiral Staff and the Greater General Staff was partially responsible for the Columbus raid. 67 James A. Sandoz thought he had found the German link to Villa in a study he made in 1970. Much of the theory was based upon interviews with José Orozco, a former major on Villa's command staff and a member of Villa's personal bodyguard the day of the Columbus raid. 68 Perhaps the single most influential man on Villa's general staff and one to whom he would listen was Dr. Lyman B. Rochebaum. Rochebaum was an Austrian German who had originally come to Juarez with Venustiano Carranza and then entered El Paso, Texas, with his family in 1911. El Alamdan, as Rochebaum was known, became Villa's personal physician and treated the entire staff. Since he was fluent in both Spanish and English, he also served as translator for Villa's men, most of who were at best a semi-literate lot. It was with this German that Villa would confer before presenting his plans to the rest of the general staff. 69 Sandoz thought that the attack on Columbus was caused by Dr. Rochebaum planting the seed in Villa's mind. Rochebaum also kept all of the records and correspondence for Villa and told Villa that the Columbus State Bank would not honor Villa's bank draft because of a lack of funds. He maintained that this was a lie and the bank was cheating Villa. Orozco maintained the bank story and also a rumor that Villa had been cheated by Sam and Louis Ravel, merchants of Columbus. Villa also knew that a raid on the Columbus Army post would bring him horses, weapons, and ammunition. However, Rochebaum was only the key to Villa when he worked in conjunction with Felix Sommerfeld. 70 Here was Sommerfeld's link to Villa. Rochebaum, as a good German, had already served the fatherland and could be depended upon to do so again. Working in conjunction with the doctor, he might manipulate Villa into creating an incident which would precipitate a war between the United States and Mexico. Subterfuge would be necessary to influence the Mexican guerrilla, and this subterfuge would be the supposed misdealings of the Columbus State Bank. 71 Sandoz still left the if in the reader's mind. None of the writers consult that advocated German intrigues would say that the Germans were behind Villa. The evidence was always a possible link. Professor Katz would not state that Villa was a pawn of the Germans and he had the German Foreign Office archives available to him. The American historians working without Katz's German sources used an interview with a former Villista, some government documents, and a book written in 1917 by a former German agent. The documents partially consist of a 30-page letter written on March 30, 1914, by Marion Letcher, American consul in Chihuahua, to the Secretary of State. Mr. Letcher described Felix Sommerfeld as chief among the henchmen of Madero who were supporting Villa. Sommerfeld was described as a German by nationality and a Jew by race and the most active of the many agents employed by Madero. He was the agent that worked in El Paso, Washington, and New York buying arms, overlooking the work of publicity agents, and smuggling arms and ammunition. He was also described as the press agent for Madero and the chief of all of Madero's confidential secret agents. Sommerfeld was further described as an absolutist, monarchist, and opportunist. 72 A U.S. Department of Justice report for April 14, 1914, quoted its Bureau of Investigation agent, E. M. Blanford in El Paso, as stating that Felix Sommerfeld was a Secret Service agent of the Mexican Constitutionalists. 73 A final document was dated after the Columbus raid and consisted of a telegram sent by J. J. Allen of New York to Colonel M. M. Parker on March 14, 1916, with instructions that Sommerfeld was to be shadowed as he was believed assisting Villa. Horst von der Goltz mentioned meeting a Dr. L. A. Rochebaum, Villa's personal physical Kian, in 1913.75. The German involvement with Villa has possibilities, but none of the authorities consulted would make a direct connection to the Columbus raid. Another ultra-revisionist theory should be examined in order to give a complete spectrum of thought on the reasons for the Columbus raid. Bill McGaw wrote in 1964 that Villa was paid $80,000 to make the raid. The money was allegedly raised by the U.S. military in order that they might secretly train troops in Mexico while supposedly pursuing Villa. George Sess, Associated Press correspondent, was to make payment but gave the money to his telegrapher, E. A. Camp, who was then to make payment. Sess was dead by 1964 and E. A. Camp was missing. McGaw's source of information was a former Villista colonel, S.A. Villanueva Zuloaga, in a 1962 interview. Zuloaga repudiated the story in 1964, but McGaw had a witness in Columbus who confirmed the same story. McGaw would not, however, name the source. Zuloaga had allegedly said that Villa was assassinated in 1923 because he had demanded more money to remain quiet about the raid. 76 Evidence equally as sound as that already cited, appeared in Mexico in 1965. The Mexican historian Alberto Calzadillas Barrera had an answer for the Columbus raid. His answer too was vengeance, but not revenge against a government, or Americans in general, but the personal vengeance of Francisco Villa against Sam Rabel. Barrera based his account on the testimony of a number of Villistas who were present when the decision to attack Columbus was made. Barrera maintained that the raid occurred because Sam Rabel, Columbus merchant, refused to return money paid in advance in July, 1913, for an order of armaments and ordnance. Villa sent Candelario Cervantes on his way to Columbus December 12, 1915, to speak with Rabel about returning the money. Sam Rabel told Cervantes that he did not have an explanation for the delay in shipment and would not return the money. Cervantes left Columbus the 28th or 29th of January, 1916, for Villa's camp at San Jacinto and arrived there the night of February 16, 1916. Cervantes related his conversation to Villa about 10 p.m. and Villa became very angry and upset with what Sam Rabel had told Cervantes. Later that same night of February 16 and 17, Le6N Secretanas Martinez related an incident to Villa and all of those present at the headquarters. The incident concerned the grievances Mexicans had suffered at the hands of Americans. Martinez noted that it was going on 69 years ago that the Americans had captured the port of Veracruz on March 9, 1847. Villa then asked all the more educated men present if the story and date were correct. It was confirmed to Villa's satisfaction. The morning of the 17th, Villa asked Cervantes the distance from the border fence to Sam Rabel's store, and Cervantes told him it was as clear as the noonday sun. Villa then announced a voluntary mission to raid Columbus. He told the men that he did not want any of the sick or infirm going but only those that were strong, healthy, and spirited. Only two colonels, Pedro Luyin and Francisco Rico, decided not to go on the raid. 77 The theory of personal vengeance was as well documented as the other theories, that is, by accounts of Mexicans who participated in the decision for the raid. The Ravel theory also answered some of the mysteries that other authorities had about Sam Ravel. Brady mentioned a similar rumor without any documentation and then dismissed it. In the town of Columbus itself, the Villistas appeared bent on finding Sam Ravel. After all, he and his brothers operated the leading mercantile store. Besides this, the raiders were familiar with the location of this well-stocked store, reportedly having traded with the Ravels. American civilian survivors of the Columbus raid are in agreement that Villa himself seemed to have a personal grudge against these prosperous merchants, in particular against Sam, the eldest brother. According to rumor, he and Villa had experienced violent differences of a personal nature. 78 Sam Ravel also bothered Clarence C. Clendenin in 1961. Aside from the insoluble mystery of why Villa did it, there are certain details that whet the interest and curiosity. One can only ask questions, but unlike the rhetorical questions quoted earlier, the answers are not implicit in the questions themselves. Why, in the midst of looting, did the Villistas make a special effort to locate Sam Ravel, a Jewish merchant of Columbus? 79 Sandos related the rumor of the Ravel story. However, the difference was that Sandos saw the German link with Dr. Rochebaum as the primary reason for the raid, not the quarrel with the Ravel brothers. Two civilian witnesses were also aware of the search the Villistas made for Sam Ravel. 1. Roy Estevizan was the school principal in Columbus and related the story of his young pupil, Arthur Ravel. The Mexicans found him in his brother's store and tried to make him tell them where his brother Sam was. When Arthur truthfully told them Sam was in El Paso, they did not believe him. They put a rope about his neck and threatened to hang him if he did not reveal the hiding place of his brother. At length he effected his escape, so Senator Albert Fall of New Mexico took testimony on the Columbus raid in 1919 and 1920. One of the witnesses was Mrs. William T. Ritchie, who leased the commercial hotel in Columbus from Sam Ravel. She related that the Mexican raiders came to the hotel with Arthur Ravel and demanded that she show them Sam Ravel's room, which she did. Senator Fall then asked her if the Mexicans had spoken the name of Sam Ravel, to which she replied in the affirmative. Senator Fall then changed the subject and never did return to the Sam Ravel question. Mrs. Ritchie went on to relate that she saw Mexicans put oil on the lemon and paint store across the street from the commercial hotel, and then the hotel caught on fire. 8 None of the authorities consulted listed the buildings burned in the raid, but most agreed that the area burned was about one city block centering on the commercial hotel owned by Sam Ravel. The possibility exists that the Mexicans set fire to Sam Ravel's commercial hotel in frustration when they could not find him there. Barrera related that Candelario Cervantes had questioned Mrs. Ritchie and that she told him that Sam Ravel was not in town but in El Paso. General Francisco Beltran then set fire to the home of the Ravel brothers, and the flames enveloped the Commercial and Hoover hotels and all of the Ravel brothers' commercial establishments. 82 None of the sources consulted put any significance to the date of the Columbus raid, March 9, as discussed earlier by Barrera. However, a search of sources revealed that on March 9, 1847, General Winfield Scott did land American troops at Veracruz and capture it. 83 Barrera's evidence appeared to stand on all counts. The question of greatest impact deals with the importance of the Columbus raid. This incident must be put into the greater perspective of history to fully understand its impact on the United States. The year 1916 saw the United States on the verge of entering World War I, and Villa's Columbus raid made the country aware of its military unpreparedness. Contemporary journalists saw this point very clearly. The periodicals of April, May, and June 1916 carried the message to the American people. Some of the journalists thought that the U.S. was not even prepared for a fourth-class skirmish, and others looked at the evidence of unpreparedness that Columbus pointed out. The reliability of our machine guns was seriously questioned and criticized by some of the press, as was the diminutive size of our 30,000-man army. Some journalists deplored the state of our army when there was a possibility of war with Japan or Germany. 84 Other comments dealt with the danger of relying on untrained or very meagerly trained troops in the event of a major crisis. 85 The discussion also included the merits of various proposals for strengthening our army, be it the National Guard or federal volunteers. 86 It is beyond the scope of this paper to discuss the solutions taken by the United States Congress to rectify our unpreparedness, but history records that the United States went into World War I in April, 1917, with a better army than she had March 9, 1916. General John J. Pershing, made famous by his campaign against Villa, headed the American Expeditionary Forces in 1917. The best summary of what Villa's raid did for the United States was written in 1916. If this raid, remarks the Rochester Post-Express, shall have effect to hurry the creation of an army adequate for the needs of the nation, it may prove to be the most fortunate thing for the country that could have occurred. 87 Sterling College E. Bruce White, Sterling, Kansas. Appendix 3 War Department, Washington, March 30, 1916. The Secretary of War presents his compliments to the Honorable the Secretary of State and has the honor to enclose herewith, for his information, copy of a letter from the Commanding General, Southern Department, Fort Sam Houston, Texas, dated March 22, 1916, forwarding a letter to Emiliano Zapata, signed by Francisco Villa, found in the saddlebags of one of Villa's officers killed at Columbus, New Mexico. March 29, 1916. Official copy. Furnished to the Honorable the Secretary of State. In reply, refer to Headquarters 19266, Southern Department, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. March 22, 1916. From, Department Commander. To, the Adjutant General of the Army. Washington, D.C. Subject, Letter from Francisco Villa to Emiliano Zapata. 1. There is forwarded herewith a letter to Emiliano Zapata signed by Francisco Villa, which was found in the saddlebags of one of Villa's officers killed at Columbus. 2. It can only be surmised whether this is the original letter, which circumstances had made it impracticable to forward to its destination, or whether it is a retained copy which Villa had signed at the same time he did the original. Frederick Funston, Major General, U.S. Army. 1 Inc. FF-led Conventionist Army. Gen. L.J. Esteo Farm San Geronimo, Chi, January 8, 1916. General Emiliano Zapata. His camp, wherever found. My esteemed companion and fine friend. I suppose that you are well informed of the general situation of our country, but if for any circumstance you do not know of the latest events in the northern part of the Republic, I am going to take the liberty to make them known to you, as follows, as I informed you in various letters which I had the pleasure to address to you from Aguascalientes, Turian, and other points. The new plan of campaign that at that time was decided upon by the generals of the Army of the North, consisted in the reconcentration of all the troops under my command in the state of Chihuahua, to invade immediately the state of Sonora, and end there the campaign started against the enemy by the conventionist troops which operate in said place, and take them together with my column through Sinaloa, Tepic, Jalisco, and Michoacan until having the pleasure of meeting you where you were. Naturally, this movement offered me facilities and advantages because of the fact that the main nucleus of Carancistas was there at the time under Obregon, between San Luis Potosí, Zacatecas, Saltillo, and Monterrey, where I succeeded in keeping them bottled up through intrepid and daring movements of my troops who destroyed the means of communication, preventing the enemy from any rapid movement of advance or retreat. Unfortunately, my plans were frustrated because of the enemy meeting with the undue and shameful help of the American government. It is needless to tell you of the innumerable fatigues and penalties that my forces suffered in a journey of 25 days through the arid and abrupt Sierra Madre, transporting 42 cannons of heavy caliber through places where there were no roads and where it is difficult for the mounts, but all these hardships were conquered by my troops, with the stoicism proper of the soldier who fights for convictions, and while being in the vicinity of Agua Prieta and on the eve of attacking it, the enemy came. through American territory and in trains with a reinforcement of 5,000 Karancistas whom the government of the United States allowed to pass. Can you imagine a bigger act of offense to the Mexican people and attack to their national sovereignty? Through a deed of excessive delicacy and dignity on my part and wishing to avoid an armed conflict with the United States, I prevented my troops from attacking American territory, as they wished to do with all justification, to punish those who impudently disregard our sacrifices, with no more right than that of strength. While I continued my advance towards the strongholds along the border in the state of Sonora, the Karancistas moved in trains through American territory with the purpose of attacking me and occupying them before me. In Nogales, with a cynicism and shame which make the decorum and dignity of my race turn into anger, the American soldiers, while the Karancistas were approaching, taking advantage of the confusion that prevailed, made fire against our troops. While I was in front of Hermosillo, I learned that the enemy, counting upon the help of the Americans, were thinking of moving in trains, through the United States, to take Ciudad Juarez. As, if successful, they would have deprived me of my supply base and done me other great harm, I tried to prevent it moving violently into state of Chihuahua, through Sierra Madre. Due to many motives, I could not arrive on time and my presentiments unfortunately had been realized, finding Ciudad Juarez in possession of the enemy. Although counting with brave and sufficient troops to start a campaign against the enemy and throw them from the state that has known how to be heroic each and every time it has been demanded by the welfare of the country, I wished to consider this matter in meeting of generals and chiefs of the army under my command, were convinced fully that the common enemy of Mexico is the United States, and that the integrity and independence of our country are about to be lost unless all honest Mexicans unite and, with the arms in our hands, prevent the consummation of the sale of the country. You may know of the treaties between Carranza and the government of Washington, in which Carranza agrees to cede to the United States Magdalena Bay for a term of 99 years, the railroads of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and Nacionales, and yield to the demands made over the petrolific zone. Also the ministers of Finances, Interior, and Foreign Relations of the Mexican government must be named to suit the White House. In return, a loan of $500,000,000 will be made to Carranza, which shall be paid from the revenues collected in land and maritime customs and other fountains of public incomes, and for which the government of Washington shall appoint interventors. From the foregoing you will see that the sale of this country is a deed, and in such circumstances and for the reasons stated previously, we decided not to fire a bullet more against the Mexicans, our brothers, and to prepare and organize ourselves to attack the Americans in their own dens and make them know that Mexico is a land for the free and tomb for thrones, crowns and traitors. With the view of informing the people of the situation and to organize and enlist the largest possible number of people with the purpose in mind, I have divided my army in guerrillas, and each commanding officer will cover the different parts of the country which they deem convenient during 6 months, which is the time we have appointed to meet again in the state of Chihuahua, with the forces that we might have recruited in the country, and then make the movement which will unite all the Mexicans. As you are an honest and patriotic Mexican, example and pride of our land, and through your veins runs Indian blood as ours, I am sure that you will never permit that our land be sold, and that you will also come to the defense of the country. As the move we have to make to the United States can only be accomplished by the North, as we do not have any ships, I beg you to tell me if you agree to come here with all your troops and on what date, so that I may have the pleasure to go personally to meet you and together start the work of reconstruction and enhancement of Mexico, punishing our eternal enemy, the one that has always been encouraging the hatred and provoking difficulties and quarrels among our race. General Eduardo Carranza, a man of my affection and estimation, will see that this letter reach your hands, and through the same channels I beg you to answer. Wishing to have soon the pleasure to give you a tight embrace, I repeat myself your companion and sure servant, Francisco Villa.